This is an LA Times Studios podcast.
From the Los Angeles Times, I'm Sammy Roth. This is Boiling Point.
Now it's like, wow, what did I do before?
Last weekend, I went for a hike with Russell Scofield, a longtime ranger and wildlife biologist at the Federal Bureau of Land Management. He worked there for nearly 3 decades before retiring in 2020. He lives in the California desert outside Joshua Tree National Park. We met up near the Salton Sea.
I always thought these ladders were a little sketchy.
Yeah.
We were in the Mecca Hills, a series of slot canyons and gorgeous rock walls formed over millions of years by earthquakes along the San Andreas Fault.
It is the Ladder Canyon.
It is.
We had to wiggle through narrow canyons and scramble up and down ladders to finish the hike. As of last month, this whole area, the Mecca Hills Wilderness, is part of Chuckwalla National Monument. It was designated by President Biden 6 days before he left office.
This monument will protect more than 624,000 acres of wildlife habitat and sacred ancestral lands.
Scientists say that protecting 30% of Earth's lands and waters by 2030 is crucial for preserving the planet's biodiversity. Biden embraced that 30 by 30 target, but also had a competing goal: to confront climate change by promoting the construction of solar and wind farms on America's public lands. The difficult job of balancing renewable energy and conservation frequently fell to Scofield's employer, the Bureau of Land Management, also known as BLM.
You know what they say, if everybody walks away from the table from a BLM plan and everybody's mad, then BLM got it right.
The Bureau has a tough job. It's legally obligated to balance many competing priorities: conservation, oil and gas drilling, recreation, Native American cultural resources, and now, renewable energy. When Russell was at the BLM, he worked on something called the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, or DRECP. It was basically a master plan for where to put solar and wind farms on public lands in the California desert, ideally without doing too much damage to wildlife habitat. It was not an easy plan to write. Americans love their public lands, and a lot of people had very strong opinions on which places should be off limits to renewable energy. But even though nobody was super happy with the DRECP when it was finalized in 2016, the plan is still in place today. Even President Trump couldn't manage to get rid of it in his first term.
The Trump effort on the DRECP, everybody said it was amending the DRECP. Well, folks, the DRECP was an amendment, and you don't amend an amendment. Sorry, I'm being bureaucratic here.
That's okay.
But,
Trump's BLM approved a lot of solar and wind farms between 2016 and 2020. But now, several years later, the world has changed. This time, it's looking like oil and gas will reign supreme. Trump has paused all approvals for renewable energy projects on public lands. That's why I wanted to hike with Russell at Chuckwalla National Monument. The monument is a great example of how to thread the needle between renewable energy and conservation, at least in my opinion. Energy companies and conservation groups struck a compromise that ensured the monument boundaries wouldn't block solar projects or power lines in those DRECP development zones. Nobody was totally happy, but everybody got some of what they wanted. I wanted to know what Russell thought would happen with renewable energy and conservation over the next 4 years. I also wanted to learn from his work over the last 30 years. We stopped near the end of our hike to record this conversation. We were standing along the side of a big sandy canyon in a little shadowy spot. A few other hikers passed by us as we talked. It was a beautiful day in the desert. Russell Scofield, thank you very much for being with us on the Boiling Point podcast.
Thank you.
So you worked at Bureau of Land Management for a long time, huh? What did you like about doing that job? What was your, what drew you to that work?
The thing about BLM versus working for some of the other agencies is that BLM has such a varied mission and such a complex mission. So you're trying to protect cultural resources, trying to protect endangered species, while at the same time providing for development opportunities and recreational opportunities. So finding that balance is both complex and challenging fun.
Yeah, National Park Service, it's just protect for people to enjoy. Forest Service, keep the trees from burning. But Bureau of Land Management, you're trying to do all these different things, right? There's
Right.
energy development, there's recreation, there's mining. You've got to sort of keep a lot of different things juggled in the air.
Absolutely. That's the thing about BLM is how do you find balances between the various uses, often competing uses, for the public lands.
Just to ground people a little, I think everyone knows what national parks are because they've been to, Yosemite or Joshua Tree or Yellowstone for Californians. What are some of the lands that BLM is known for? What might people identify with?
Well, we're standing in Chuckwalla National Monument right now, so hopefully they are starting to learn about that. Here in California, the BLM manages quite a number of national monuments, but it's more than the national monuments. Of course, we've got, so many of the rocks and islands off the coast are a part of the California Coastal National Monument. But we've got other areas, for example, the Amargosa River just to the east of Death Valley, which is extremely unique, very rich biologically. And it's not a national monument, but it's a protected area, and is very unique. Sees a lot of visitors. BLM manages redwoods, BLM manages sequoia trees, BLM manages beeches, and BLM manages what people generally think we manage here out in the desert.
Leaders like you know that success is all about making the right choices, and that includes where you shop. At Shop LA Times, we curate items designed to inspire, inform, and impress. Plan your next escape with our 50 Best Beaches in Southern California zine, featuring top beaches perfect to relax and recharge. Challenge your mind with our crossword zines, annual editions that turn downtime into brainpower since 2020. And for the discerning collector, explore Dodgers World Series newspapers and timeless personalized newspaper books that capture history in your hands. Elevate your everyday with Shop LA Times. Visit us now and use code BoilingPoint10 to enjoy 10% off select items.
So we've been hiking for the last couple hours here in the Mecca Hills, part of the New Chuckwalla National Monument, like you said, and it's gorgeous here. This is one of my favorite spots. Tell me a little bit about what it was like when you first started to see renewable energy developers trying to build in this part of the desert. Not here in this monument, because these are, incredible slot canyons and these, sheer walls of rock. But how long was this? Like 15, 20 years ago, maybe?
Something like that. It was after George W. Bush signed the Energy Act of, what was that, 15?
Yeah, I think 2005, maybe, energy policy.
2005, right, 15 years ago. So 20 years ago, I can't do
Time
math.
flies.
Yeah, time flies when you're having fun. But places like this at that time, even though it wasn't a national monument then, it was still wilderness. So areas like this, where we're standing right now at least, were not under threat. There were other areas within the national monument that could have been and were threatened by renewable energy development.
So this monument goes all the way out to the border with Arizona, right?
Yeah, I think it goes all the way to, I was looking at the maps last night, I think it goes all the way to Highway 95.
Highway 95. So big tracts of desert sort of between here, stretching out to the east and north and south up towards the 10 and then down south towards the Imperial Valley.
Right, and there's I think two parts of it on the north side of 10.
Okay.
In between Desert Center and Joshua Tree. But anyway, in 2005, around 2006 timeframe, BLM started seeing a lot of applications for renewable energy, and some of it at just unbelievable scale. A lot of that we thought was strictly speculation, and a lot of that, because it was speculation, the applications were rejected. Also, a lot of applications, people would just go out and they would file an application on public land without doing any due diligence. So you would get applications filed on top of wilderness. You would get applications filed just in places that would never be permitted, that BLM wouldn't even entertain analyzing whether it should be permitted.
So these weren't serious energy companies trying to do this. This was just people
Some were serious.
Okay.
Most, I don't think, were. That was kind of the consensus at the time.
But I take it eventually companies started coming in with real plans that were doing their
Yes.
homework and saying, hey, this is a spot where we could, put a solar farm, hear us out.
Yes, the renewable energy industry at the time was very young. It has since matured significantly, and yes, they understand how the process works now, and they understand what they need to do to be permitted on public land, and they understand how to work with BLM.
You have a background in natural resources and wildlife, right?
Correct.
So what were some of the things you were thinking about as these developers started proposing these projects in terms of, protecting public lands and protecting wildlife in the desert?
So, of course, you can't talk about wildlife in the desert without talking about desert tortoise, whose population numbers are just circling the toilet. So you look at the tortoise, you look at other species that may be on the endangered species list. How would these projects potentially impact those species' habitat, either directly or indirectly? Would it result in actual habitat loss? Would it result in maybe not habitat loss, but habitat fragmentation? Would it result in bringing in disease or invasive species? Would it block migration corridors? And then, that's not even considering what's it going to look like in climate change and how is that habitat going to shift?
I mean, as we've been hiking here, I think we've been seeing the effects of climate change a little bit. You were pointing out to me ocotillos that were already blooming on February 1st.
That seems a little bit early.
Yeah. I'm happy it's a beautiful day. Not wearing a jacket, it's sunny out, it's warm, but you've seen this stuff over the years, haven't you?
Yes, it just seems like spring's coming, and this is just a warm spell. Maybe it's not spring.
I know. You got to do attribution studies and figure it out later. But on the whole, it's not that hard to see what's going on.
Anecdotally, I think you can look around and say spring's coming earlier. It's warmer. Up where I live at about 4,000 feet. When we first moved there in the 90s, early 90s, it rarely got into the 90s, mid-90s. Now we have days in the hundreds every year.
So you've got these developers who are proposing these big solar farms, and you've got to deal with the ecological consequences of that and being careful about tortoises and migration corridors and just ecosystems writ large. But clearly there's a tension here. There's a balance because these are projects that society in a lot of ways needs to deal with climate change as well.
Well, it's a balance.
Yeah.
It's always a balance. You've got the absolute need for us to find solutions to climate change, ways to replace fossil fuels, but at the same time, we have to be careful not to destroy one of the last major moderately intact ecosystems that we have in California.
One of the, and I find this hard to write about sometimes. This is a topic that I've written all sorts of stories about, and it's so fraught. The opinions that I hear from people, the people I interview and readers reading these stories, there are people who care so badly, understandably, about the desert and about these ecosystems, and there are people who so badly just, are focused on fossil fuels and building renewables. It's really tough, and I imagine it probably wasn't the easiest thing for you to work on in dealing with a lot of these different groups and stakeholders.
Well, anytime you talk about land management, it becomes an impassioned conversation because everywhere is somebody's favorite spot to do something, it seems like. or everywhere is important biologically or culturally.
Right, you've got tribes, and you've got wildlife, and you've got off-roaders, and you've got rockhounds, and you've got rural communities that like their views. I mean, there's something everywhere, and it makes sense.
Exactly. So there's no spot where you can say this spot, there's no conflict. That just isn't going to happen. So you look for areas where you have lower conflicts. Maybe it's really lousy habitat, but it's very rich culturally. Well, that's probably not a lower conflict area. But maybe you've got an area that's really lousy habitat and it doesn't really have that many cultural resources. And maybe that's a little bit lower conflict, even though it still might be someone's favorite spot to go hiking or to ride their dirt bike on or whatever. And it's those lower conflict areas that you hope you can strike the balance with to permit development.
And this is something that obviously you worked on during your time at Bureau of Land Management, and I hate acronyms, so I'll try not to use this one too much, but the DRECP, the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, or is it and Conservation Plan?
Either.
Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, I'll spare the one word. And this is something that I wrote about back when I was at the Desert Sun in Palm Springs, but the basic idea was that it was this big look at 10 million acres, right, of federal land, I think was the number. And the goal was to figure out where in the desert, what lands should be conserved and what lands should renewable energy be allowed to be built on. This was a big, long process that took a long time, and I think you were involved with it to an extent. I don't know. What do you think about how that all went down? What was your feeling about that?
Yeah, I was involved a little bit in the development and a lot in its implementation, but DRECP was a tough needle to thread because again, you've got these large scale renewable energy projects coming in that we absolutely need to find a way to accommodate their development. However, we want to find those lower conflict areas while at the same time providing adequate conservation that offsets the development. So that's what DRECP was all about, was not just identifying where the development needed to go and focusing the development in those development focal areas, but then also how do we develop a conservation strategy that's going to allow us to do this? How are we going to develop a conservation strategy that lets us permit these renewable energy projects while at the same time not making the tortoise go extinct, still upholding our responsibilities under the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water, Clean Air Act, etc.
Yeah, you have a lot of laws that you have to follow, which is good. It's good that we have those laws.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think it, and I want to ask you about the implementation since that was your main job, but do you think it struck an okay balance on the whole?
I do. The joke is, I told you earlier, if everyone leaves a public land planning process just a little bit irritated, then it probably went okay.
That was my experience writing about it. I don't remember anyone telling me, this is perfect.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't perfect. There's public land, multiple use manager. There's no such thing as the perfect plan because everybody has their own idea of what the perfect plan is, right?
I seem to recall nobody sued.
No one sued. We were all expecting to be sued, but no one sued.
Right. And then Trump got elected and tried to undo the whole thing.
Well, we started trying to implement it, but then there was an election, and the new administration, the incoming administration, was not real happy with some of the conservation portions of the DRECP.
Right. Because ultimately the balance you struck, as I recall, was there were millions of acres of conservation designations and a few 100,000 or less than a million acres of development areas or possible development areas.
Right. There's 388,000 acres of development focal areas compared to, millions of acres that were designated or in many cases redesignated in a whole variety of conservation acronyms.
And so Trump's appointees probably thought, that's too much conservation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So you started to try to undo that at their direction, but didn't end up happening?
Well, we were instructed to look at some of the conservation designations and reduce where we could. They didn't say do a wholesale elimination. There was never anything like that. But look at the designations that might be unnecessary and eliminate some of those. What we did was we looked at areas where we had an administrative conservation designation, meaning a conservation designation that BLM just does on its own versus something that the Congress or the President does. So we looked at some of those administrative conservation designations that were within designated wilderness, which of course designated wilderness is the highest level designation of conservation we have in this country. So those administrative designations could probably be removed within wilderness with very little or really no practical implications on the ground. It's already conservation by the wilderness designation. Similarly, we had overlapping conservation designations. Some of those were collapsed into a single conservation designation. The result was what appeared to be the reduction of a lot of conservation, but in fact, very little reduction in conservation acres on the ground.
Did it ever really come to pass, though?
No. BLM was going through the planning process. We published a draft EIS, and then I think we had another election, and the new Biden administration put a stop to the amendment that we were working on.
Now that Trump has taken office again, it's interesting because they wanted you to undo the conservation stuff, but they didn't stop you from going forward with the renewable energy development areas. But
correct.
It seems that Trump has taken a much more aggressive, or at least his appointees, a much more aggressive stance against renewable energy on public lands. In the first couple of days, just in the first week, immediate pause on solar and wind energy permitting on public lands nationwide. There was a big wind farm in Idaho, Lava Ridge, that the Republicans in Idaho really don't seem to like. They're trying to actually revoke the approval for that. Have you been surprised, or I guess what's your reaction been just watching that play out, where they seemed like they were okay with renewables last time, and now they're trying to put a stop to it?
Yeah, I am a little surprised just based on what they did in Trump's first term. So I'm surprised based on that. At the same time, it seems like solar, wind is probably not a part of his energy makeup. In the first administration, we had the all of the above category. So I don't know if solar and wind are no longer a part of all of the above.
I'd forgotten that was the phrase, all of the above.
Yeah.
That's really not it anymore, huh?
Yeah, apparently not. So I guess we have to wait and see.
You were telling me earlier that you wish we could do it all with rooftop solar. That's probably impractical. What do you see as the function of public lands in getting us off of fossil fuels? What do you think is the role they can play?
Well, the DRECP, as I said, identifies 388,000 acres of development focus areas where renewable energy projects will be streamlined. So if we fully build out the DFAs, we could get something like 27,000 megawatts of renewable energy. The point being that, yes, there's an opportunity to make a lot of renewable energy in the desert within those development focus areas, those lower conflict areas that were designated as some people would refer to them as the sacrifice areas. At the same time, where does public land play into this? Transmission. Moving energy from point A to point B. Public lands basically surround the entire LA basin, San Diego. You can't get to LA without driving across public lands somewhere. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking to move energy from Nevada, from Arizona to California, or vice versa, I don't know if that occurs, then you're going to need to cross public lands. If you're looking at moving gas communication lines, all of that's going to cross public lands. You can't avoid it. So that's another role that the BLM and the public lands play in our new renewable energy future.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about the monument we're standing in right now, Chuckwalla National Monument. I mean, the way it was crafted, I don't know the exact specs of it, but there was kind of a sort of deal reached between the conservation organizations, such as yours, Cal Wild, and the tribes that were campaigning for the monument, and renewable energy companies in Southern California, Edison, the utility, to sort of do some carve-outs, as I understand it, to make sure there would be room to do transmission lines to wheel renewable energy, through areas that might have otherwise been designated as monument to the coastal areas, which I thought was really interesting and maybe a model for future cooperation.
Yeah, and you've got the I-10 transmission corridor, which is a designated utility corridor.
Yeah, the 10 freeway.
Yeah. And if you drive to Phoenix, you'll see the transmission towers. Is also, I believe, there's a gas line there as well. There's at least one pinch point between designated wilderness and Joshua Tree National Park, where you can only put in so much transmission. So, it's important to avoid blocking those corridors. That, a big something that has to be considered even in permitting renewable energy projects out in the East Riverside development focus area, the one around Desert Center.
Yeah, out by Joshua Tree, south of the park.
Exactly, but that transmission corridor goes through the development focus area, so it's important that you don't block future transmission with future solar energy projects.
It's so complicated.
It's a complicated game.
What do you think when you go to that area out by Desert Center with all the solar farms out there? Just because how do you feel when you drive past that?
Part of me feels, optimistic for the future, that we are slowly moving towards a renewable energy future. Part of me, though, the desert rat part of me is a little depressed at the same time, because that valley, beautiful valley.
Yeah, I mean, there were people who moved out there to Desert Center, to that town, because it's such a beautiful valley.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I asked that question just because you've lived out here for, 30 plus years?
Yeah, more than 30 years.
Yeah, and I only lived out here a couple of years, but I understand, philosophically, it's like, it's really tough. You use the phrase sacrifice zones, and I would love to think we could do it all with rooftop solar, and I've written plenty of times about the various studies and political realities basically coming to the conclusion that you're not going to really get anywhere close, and here's why we should go as far as we can with rooftop solar, and then figure out, like you're saying, the low conflict areas, and do it the best we can the other way. And I enjoy this conversation because I like that we're talking realistically about how do you do the trade-offs as best you can, but it's hard because I know that no matter what I write, there are a lot of folks who I'm never going to convince to have that conversation, because it's a hard thing to see and accept. It's really challenging.
It is. When you look at the needs of the country as a whole, and the fact that the public lands belong to all of us, whether we live here in the desert or whether we live in Indianapolis. They're our public lands, and how do we use them for the greater good? And oftentimes, the greater good is conservation, recreation, the national monument we're standing in. But in some cases, the greater good is development of one form or another, whether that's transmission, so you can have electricity in Los Angeles, or whether it's renewable energy, so we can hopefully wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. We have to accept that to a degree.
Russell Scofield, thank you for being with us on the Boiling Point podcast.
Thanks for having me.
As it happens, the Mecca Hills Wilderness is one of the places I learned to love hiking. A friend took me there in 2014, just a few months after I got a job covering energy at the Desert Sun newspaper in Palm Springs. The slot canyons and beautiful desert scenery were just so inspiring. So when I learned the Mecca Hills would be part of Chuckwalla National Monument, I was thrilled. Now we'll have to wait and see if Biden's monument designation lasts, or if Trump tries to undo it. If he does, we'll have to wait and see if the Supreme Court lets him. The question of whether presidents have the power to undo national monuments has never been legally settled. We'll also have to see if Republicans in Congress try to repeal parts of the 1906 Antiquities Act, the law that gives presidents the authority to designate national monuments. Russell thinks they might. Thank you for listening to Boiling Point. I'm your host, Sammy Roth. My producers are Mary Knopf and Jonathan Shiflett. Sound design and original music by Jonathan Shiflett. Elijah Wolfson is our editor. Denise Callahan is our studio manager. Ben Church is our production manager. Nick Norton is our engineer. Special thanks to LA Times studio president Anna Magzanian, president and chief operating officer of the Los Angeles Times Chris Argentieri, and executive editor of the Los Angeles Times Terry Tang. Boiling Point is executive produced by Darius Derrickson and created by me, Sammy Roth.